The morning light filtering through the shutters brings no warmth, only the cruel reminder that another day of hunger has begun. You are Marguerite, a 30-year-old woman in the village of Saint-Étienne during the winter of 1315, and the world around you is slowly dying. The Great Famine has gripped Europe for months now, turning once prosperous communities into desperate collections of hollow-eyed survivors. Today, like every day for the past 4 months, you will wake to the knowing emptiness in your belly and the impossible task of keeping your family alive when there is simply nothing left to eat. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can also listen on Spotify or explore history audiobooks on Audible. Both are linked in the description for you. Your eyes open to the familiar sensation of cold seeping through every crack in the cottage walls. The straw beneath you provides little cushioning against the hard-packed earth floor, and your thin woolen blanket offers scant protection against the bitter December air. Beside you, your husband Henri's breathing comes in shallow, labored puffs. His once strong frame has withered to skin and bone, his ribs now visible through the threadbare shirt he hasn't removed in weeks. The luxury of changing clothes belongs to a world that feels impossibly distant now, a time when soap existed and when people had the strength to heat water for washing. The silence in the cottage tells you everything you need to know about the day ahead. No crackling fire greets your awakening because there is no wood left to burn. The small pile of kindling you've been hoarding sits in the corner like a precious treasure reserved for only the most desperate moments when the cold threatens to claim another life. You've already burned the wooden bowls, the extra stool, and even the handle of your late father's axe. The furniture that once made this place a home has been transformed into brief moments of warmth, leaving behind only the bare essentials needed for survival. Your stomach clenches with the familiar pain that has become your constant companion. The sensation goes beyond simple hunger now. It's a deep, aching void that seems to consume you from within, a relentless reminder that your body is slowly devouring itself to stay alive. The last real meal you remember eating was in early September, before the endless rains destroyed what remained of the harvest. Since then, you've survived on a rotating collection of increasingly desperate substitutes for food. The daily ritual begins as you force yourself to sit up, fighting against the weakness that makes every movement feel like pushing through thick mud. Your muscles have no strength left to give, powered now only by the fierce determination to see your children live another day. Standing requires careful planning, a gradual process of shifting weight and finding balance as your body protests against the demands you place upon it. The dizziness that accompanies every change in position has become so routine that you barely notice it anymore. Just another obstacle to navigate in the complex choreography of survival. Your first task each morning is to check on the children. 7-year-old Marie sleeps curled against the wall, her small body barely visible beneath the collection of rags and scraps that serve as her bedding. Her breathing is steady but shallow, and when you place your hand gently on her forehead, her skin feels cool and papery. She has not spoken in 3 days, conserving what little energy remains for the basic functions of staying alive. The bright, chattering child who once filled the cottage with laughter has retreated deep within herself, emerging only when absolutely necessary. Your youngest, 4-year-old Pierre, stirs restlessly beside his sister. His sleep is fitful and punctuated by soft whimpering sounds that break your heart anew each time you hear them. His little belly, once round and healthy, now protrudes grotesquely from his skeletal frame, swollen with the cruel mockery of malnutrition. When he opens his eyes to look at you, the spark of childhood curiosity that once danced there has been replaced by an ancient weariness that no child should ever have to carry. The morning assessment continues as you inventory what remains of your family's resources. In the corner where your ladder once stood, a single turnip sits like a precious gem. This gnarled, half-rotten vegetable represents the sum total of your food stores, the difference between eating today and not eating at all. You've been rationing it over the past week, cutting away the blackened portions and stretching each morsel to last as long as possible. Today, you calculate you might be able to create one more thin soup if you're careful with the portions. Water, at least, remains available, though even this basic necessity requires effort you can barely afford to expend. The well in the village square still produces clean water, but the walk there and back demands precious energy and exposes you to the bitter wind that cuts through your inadequate clothing like a knife. Your shoes, once sturdy leather boots that Henri crafted for you during the prosperous times, now consist more of carefully placed rags and binding cord than actual footwear. Each step on the frozen ground sends sharp pains through your feet, but the alternative of staying inside means certain death for your children. The question of warmth presents another impossible choice in your daily calculations. You could burn one of your remaining pieces of kindling to create a small fire that might last an hour, providing brief comfort and the ability to warm whatever meager food you can prepare. But once that wood is gone, it's gone forever, and the days ahead stretch endlessly into a winter that shows no signs of ending. The weather patterns this year have been unlike anything the oldest villagers can remember, with rain destroying the crops during growing season and early snows that arrived weeks before their usual time. Your husband begins to stir, his movements slow and deliberate as consciousness returns. Henri was once the strongest man in the village, capable of working from dawn to dusk and still having energy to play with the children in the evening. Now, the simple act of sitting up leaves him breathless and shaking. His eyes, when they meet yours, carry the same mixture of love and desperation that has characterized your relationship during these terrible months. Without words, you communicate the day's grim realities. He knows, as you know, that today will bring the same impossible choices that have defined every day since the famine began. The children's needs take precedence over everything else, a calculation that requires no conscious thought. Whatever food exists will go to them first, followed by Henri, who needs strength to venture out in search of work or sustenance. You will eat last, if at all, accepting hunger as the price of keeping your family alive. This hierarchy of survival has become so natural that you no longer question it, just as you no longer question the wisdom of boiling tree bark to create something that resembles soup, or the necessity of eating grass when no other options remain. Outside your cottage, the sounds of the village tell their own story of desperation. The normal bustle of morning activity has been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by occasional coughing fits or the sound of someone splitting what little wood they might have found. The laughter of children at play has vanished completely, replaced by the subdued voices of parents trying to comfort little ones who don't understand why their stomachs hurt or why Mama and Papa look so worried all the time. Even the animals have fallen silent, those few that haven't already been slaughtered and eaten in the early weeks of the famine. The village priest still rings the bell for morning prayers, though the congregation that gathers has dwindled to a handful of the most devout or most desperate. Father Guillaume himself has grown gaunt, his once round face now drawn and hollow, though he continues to offer what comfort he can to his suffering parishioners. His sermons have taken a different character in recent weeks, focusing less on abstract theological concepts and more on practical guidance for enduring hardship with dignity and faith. He speaks often of Job's trials, drawing parallels between biblical suffering and the very real anguish that grips every household in the village. The social structures that once governed village life have begun to break down under the pressure of survival. Neighbors who once shared tools and helped with harvests now eye each other with suspicion, wondering what hidden stores of food might exist behind closed doors. Accusations of hoarding have led to bitter disputes between families who lived in harmony for generations. The bonds of community that held the village together during good times have proven fragile when tested by genuine desperation. Yet even in this darkness, small acts of kindness continue to emerge. Yesterday, old widow Agnes appeared at your door with a handful of acorns she had gathered from the forest floor. The bitter nuts required extensive boiling to become even marginally edible, but they represent calories that might keep your children alive for another day. She asked for nothing in return, understanding that you have nothing to give, and the simple gesture brought tears to your eyes for the first time in weeks. Such moments of grace remind you that humanity persists even when everything else seems lost. The morning routine continues with the careful rationing of water for washing. A small basin serves multiple purposes, first for drinking, then for the minimal cleaning that hygiene demands, and finally for soaking the last scraps of the turnip to extract every possible bit of nutrition. Nothing can be wasted when waste means death, and every drop of water must serve its maximum purpose.
Water will eventually be used to dampen the earth floor, reducing the dust that aggravates the persistent coughs that have developed in the absence of proper nutrition. As you prepare to face another day of impossible choices, the weight of responsibility settles on your shoulders like a familiar burden. Today, you will need to decide whether to venture into the forest, searching for anything edible, knowing that others have already stripped the area bare of obvious food sources. You will need to determine how much of your remaining turnip to use now versus saving for tomorrow, gambling with your family's immediate hunger against the uncertainty of future meals. You will need to choose between burning precious fuel for warmth or saving it for cooking, between exposing yourself to the dangerous cold or remaining inside while your children grow weaker. The sun climbs higher in the winter sky, offering the promise of light, but no warmth to speak of. Another day of the great famine has begun, and you are Marguerite, a medieval woman facing the ancient human struggle against starvation with nothing but determination, love for your family, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, you will find a way to survive until spring arrives to break winter's deadly grip on the land. The reality of your situation crystallizes as you begin the morning's first impossible decision. The turnip in your possession could provide a watery broth that might quiet the children's hunger pangs for a few hours. Or you could attempt to preserve half of it for tomorrow, risking their immediate suffering against the uncertainty of finding anything else to eat. Your hands shake slightly as you pick up the vegetable, feeling its weight and examining the soft spots that indicate advancing decay. Time is not on your side, and every hour of delay means more of this precious food will become inedible. Marie's eyes flutter open as you move about the cottage, and she watches you with the silent intensity that has replaced her former chattiness. She understands with the terrible wisdom that hunger teaches children too early that speaking requires energy better saved for survival. When she does speak, her voice comes out as barely more than a whisper, asking not for food or warmth, but simply wondering when Papa will be strong enough to tell stories again. The question pierces through your heart more sharply than any physical pain the famine has inflicted. Henri attempts to rise from the straw bedding, his movements careful and calculated to avoid the dizzy spells that have become increasingly frequent. His role as provider and protector weighs heavily on him, perhaps even more than the physical hunger. Medieval men derived their identity from their ability to care for their families, and the famine has stripped him of this fundamental purpose. He speaks in short, measured sentences now, conserving breath while trying to maintain the appearance of strength for the children's sake. The cottage itself tells the story of your family's gradual descent into desperation. Hooks on the walls that once held tools now stand empty, the implements long since traded away for handfuls of grain in the early weeks of the crisis. The wooden chest that contained your family's few valuables sits open and hollow, its contents exchanged for food that provided perhaps 3 days of meager sustenance. Even your wedding ring, a simple band of pewter that Henri had saved months to afford, disappeared weeks ago into the hands of a traveling merchant who offered a small sack of barley in exchange. The process of preparing the morning's meal requires careful ceremony and precise measurement. You slice the turnip with a knife so dull it barely qualifies as a blade, having been used for everything from cutting food to scraping bark from trees to digging in the frozen ground. Each piece must be exactly the same size to ensure fair distribution, though the portions have grown smaller each day as your supplies dwindle. The children watch this ritual with the focused attention of scholars, knowing that these few morsels represent the difference between having strength to move and lying motionless in the straw. Water for cooking comes from the pot that sits beside your door, a vessel that once seemed comically large for your family's needs, but now appears almost mockingly spacious for the thin broths it contains. The ice film that forms on the surface each night must be broken carefully to avoid wasting any of the precious liquid underneath. Even this basic task requires planning and energy conservation, as the repetitive motion of breaking ice can leave your weakened arms aching for hours. The fire you eventually decide to build consists of just 3 small pieces of wood, each one representing a calculated gamble with your family's future warmth. The smoke that rises from these meager flames carries with it not just the scent of burning wood, but the essence of furniture that once made your house a home. Today's fire consumes what was once the leg of your grandmother's stool, a piece of family history transformed into a brief moment of warmth and the ability to cook your rationed food. As the turnip pieces simmer in water barely sufficient to cover them, you add ingredients that would have been unthinkable during times of plenty. Tree bark, carefully stripped and boiled to remove the most bitter compounds, provides bulk, if not nutrition. Grass gathered from beneath the snow adds color and the illusion of substance to the broth. A few precious grains of salt, hoarded from better times, help mask the unpalatable flavors of desperation that characterize your current diet. Pierre awakens with the soft whimpering that has replaced his former cheerful morning chatter. His small body curls instinctively toward the weak warmth of the fire, and his eyes seek out your face with the desperate trust that children reserve for their parents even in the darkest circumstances. When he asks for milk, a request that has become routine despite its impossibility, your heart breaks anew. The village's cows succumbed to starvation months ago, and even the memory of fresh milk seems like a fantasy from another lifetime. The morning's activities must be carefully choreographed to maximize efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. Every movement serves multiple purposes, every action calculated to preserve strength while accomplishing necessary tasks. Stirring the pot provides warmth for your hands while ensuring the meager soup doesn't burn. Adjusting the children's bedding serves to check on their condition while conserving the heat their bodies generate. Even conversation becomes strategic, with words chosen carefully to provide comfort without requiring extensive vocal effort. Outside your cottage, the village begins its own morning ritual of survival. Smoke rises from only a handful of chimneys, indicating which families still possess fuel for fires. The absence of smoke from many homes tells its own grim story, marking households where the choice between warmth and preserving wood for cooking has been decided in favor of the latter. The sound of axes that once rang out regularly as villages prepared their daily fuel has been replaced by the soft scraping of people searching for any combustible material that might have been overlooked. The church bell rings again, its bronze voice carrying across the frozen village with a clarity that seems almost supernatural in the thin winter air. Father Guillaume's calls to prayer have taken on new meaning during the famine, serving less as reminders of scheduled worship and more as signals that another day has begun and that the village still possesses enough life to mark its passage. The bell itself has become a symbol of continuity, proof that some traditions endure even when everything else crumbles. Your own spiritual life has undergone profound changes during these months of suffering. Prayers once focused on gratitude and requests for prosperity have transformed into desperate bargaining with divine forces that seem increasingly distant.
You find yourself promising impossible devotions in exchange for just one more day of life for your children, offering sacrifices you don't possess in hopes of miraculous intervention that logic tells you will not come. The soup reaches a temperature that passes for hot, though the weak fire provides barely enough heat to warm the liquid through. This moment represents the culmination of the morning's efforts, the transformation of your last food into something that might sustain life for a few more hours. The aroma that rises from the pot bears little resemblance to the hearty stews that once filled your cottage with inviting scents, but it represents hope in its most basic form. Serving the meal requires its own careful protocol, developed through weeks of practice and refined by necessity. Marie receives the first portion, not because she is the eldest, but because her smaller body seems most vulnerable to the cold. Pierre follows, his serving carefully measured to account for his age and size. Henri's portion comes next, larger than the children's because his frame requires more fuel, but still pathetically small by any reasonable standard. Your own serving, when it finally comes, consists of whatever remains in the pot after the others have been fed. Some days this means a few spoonfuls of thin broth, other days merely the water in which the vegetables were cooked. Today, fortune grants you several small pieces of turnip and enough liquid to feel the warmth spreading through your empty stomach. The sensation brings tears to your eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of having something, anything to fill the gnawing void within. The family eats in silence, each person focused entirely on extracting maximum satisfaction from their meager portion. The turnip pieces are chewed slowly.
Whatever nutrition might be available. The broth is sipped rather than swallowed, held in the mouth to appreciate its warmth before allowing it to slide down throats that have forgotten the sensation of being truly satisfied. As the meal concludes, the morning's next phase begins with the inevitable question of what to do with the remaining daylight hours. Venturing outside means exposure to cold that could prove fatal in your weakened state, but staying inside guarantees that no new food sources will be discovered. The forest beckons with the possibility of overlooked nuts, forgotten root vegetables, or bark from trees that others haven't yet stripped bare. Henry volunteers to make the journey alone, attempting to spare you the dangerous exposure, but his weakened condition makes this suggestion impractical. The task of foraging requires careful observation, patient searching, and the ability to distinguish between potentially edible plants and those that could prove poisonous. Your knowledge of local flora, gained from years of gathering herbs and vegetables during prosperous times, makes you the more logical choice for this dangerous but necessary expedition. The decision to venture out requires its own preparations, each step carefully considered to maximize your chances of survival and success. Your outer garments, such as they are, must be arranged to provide maximum protection while allowing freedom of movement. The rope that serves as a belt needs to be tied securely enough to prevent the loss of any items you might find, but not so tightly that it restricts circulation in your weakened body. Your bare feet touch the frozen earth floor, and the shock of cold travels up through your bones like lightning. The rags wrapped around your feet provide little protection, but they're all that stands between you and frostbite that could claim your toes within hours. Each step toward the door requires deliberate calculation, as sudden movements could trigger the fainting spells that have become increasingly common as your body struggles to maintain basic functions on virtually no fuel. The wooden door, warped from moisture and cold, resists your efforts to open it. The leather hinges have grown stiff and brittle, threatening to snap under pressure. When you finally manage to create a gap wide enough to peer through, the sight that greets you confirms your worst fears about the day ahead. Fresh snow has fallen during the night, covering whatever meager food sources might have existed beneath a blanket of white that makes foraging nearly impossible. The wind that rushes through the doorway carries with it the scent of death that has begun to permeate the village. Not the clean, quick death of accident or disease, but the slow, inexorable decay of a community starving by degrees. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the sound of someone coughing, a wet, rattling sound that speaks of lungs weakened by malnutrition and cold. The noise echoes off the empty cottages where families once lived, creating a hollow reminder of how many neighbors have already succumbed to the famine's relentless advance. Your breath creates small clouds in the frigid air as you contemplate the journey ahead. The forest lies perhaps a quarter-mile beyond the village boundaries, a distance that once seemed negligible but now looms like an impossible expedition across hostile territory. The path that leads there has become treacherous with ice, and the energy required to navigate it safely could consume more calories than any food you might discover at your destination. Behind you, the children stir restlessly as cold air infiltrates the cottage's meager warmth. Pierre's whimpering grows more pronounced as his small body rebels against the dropping temperature, and Marie pulls her thin coverings more tightly around her shoulders. The fire you built earlier has already begun to die down, its brief life measured in minutes rather than hours. The choice between closing the door to preserve what little heat remains and leaving it open to facilitate your departure becomes another impossible calculation in the endless series of life-or-death decisions that define your existence. Henri's voice, barely audible above the wind, offers to accompany you despite his obvious weakness. The suggestion carries both love and desperation, a husband's instinct to protect, warring with the practical reality that he lacks the strength for such an undertaking. His legs shake visibly when he attempts to stand, and the effort leaves him breathless and pale. The sight of his deterioration forces you to confront the possibility that your family might not survive as a unit, that choices may soon need to be made about who has the best chance of living through the winter. The decision to venture out alone crystallizes as you observe your family's condition. HR's strength must be preserved for tasks that require less physical exertion but equal importance, such as maintaining the fire and watching over the children during your absence. The risk of leaving them unattended pales in comparison to the certainty that without new food sources, today might be their last day of consciousness before the final slide into starvation's embrace. Your preparation for departure consists of gathering items that might prove useful during the foraging expedition. A small sack woven from scraps of cloth and barely larger than your fist could hold whatever treasures you might discover. The dull knife serves multiple purposes, from digging in frozen ground to cutting bark from trees to defending against the desperate animals that might compete with you for whatever edible materials remain in the forest. A length of rope, salvaged from better times, could help you reach higher branches or secure yourself if weakness threatens to topple you into the snow. The psychological preparation proves even more challenging than the physical arrangements. Leaving your family means accepting the possibility that you might not return, that your weakened body could succumb to cold or exhaustion somewhere in the woods, leaving them to face their final hours alone. The alternative, remaining in the cottage while your food stores dwindle to nothing, offers only the certainty of collective death. The choice between probable failure and guaranteed doom drives you forward despite every instinct screaming for you to stay close to your loved ones. The first steps outside feel like walking into an Arctic wasteland designed specifically to test human endurance. The snow crunches beneath your wrapped feet with a sound that seems impossibly loud in the morning stillness. Each footfall sends sharp pains through your legs as muscles weakened by months of malnutrition struggle to support even your drastically reduced body weight. The wind cuts through your inadequate clothing with surgical precision, finding every gap in your defenses and exploiting them mercilessly. The village around you presents a tableau of abandonment and despair that would have been unimaginable just months ago. Cottages that once bustled with family life now stand empty, their doors hanging open to reveal interiors stripped of anything that could be burned or eaten. Gardens that produced abundant vegetables during the growing season have been dug up repeatedly by desperate hands searching for overlooked roots or tubers, leaving behind only churned earth frozen into hostile ridges and valleys. The well in the village center, once a gathering place where neighbors exchanged news and gossip, now serves as a stark reminder of how dramatically social interactions have changed. The wooden bucket that hangs from its rope appears to be the only thing in the village that hasn't been repurposed for survival. Even the stones that line the well's interior have been examined for any moss or lichen that might provide sustenance, leaving behind surfaces scoured clean by fingernails desperate enough to scrape nutrition from rock itself. Your progress through the village reveals other signs of the community's dissolution. The blacksmith's forge sits cold and empty, its tools long since traded away for food that provided perhaps a week's sustenance. The mill that once processed grain for the entire region has become a hollow shell, its great wheel frozen in place and its stones silent for the first time in living memory. Even the church, traditionally a sanctuary that remained inviolate during times of trouble, shows signs of desperate scavenging, with brass fittings and wooden decorations mysteriously absent from their usual places. The few villagers who remain move through this devastated landscape like ghosts, their movements slow and deliberate as they conserve energy for only the most essential tasks. When your paths cross with Widow Bertrid, neither of you speaks, communication reduced to brief nods that acknowledge shared suffering without wasting precious breath on words. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence and humor, now hold only the hollow stare of someone who has seen too much death and expects to join it soon. The boundary between village and forest arrives sooner than expected, not by any formal barrier, but by the gradual transition from human devastation to natural dormancy. The trees ahead offer the promise of resources yet unexplored, though logic tells you that others have already combed these woods thoroughly in their own desperate searches for sustenance. Still, the possibility that something might have been overlooked, that fortune might grant you the miracle of discovering food where others found none, provides the motivation necessary to continue forward despite your body's protests. The forest floor beneath the snow tells its own story of desperate human activity. The ground has been disturbed repeatedly by people digging for roots, scraping away layers of earth in search of anything that might prove edible. Bark has been stripped from trees in irregular patches, creating wounds in the wood that weep sap frozen in place. The vixen watches you from a distance, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She knows your desperation, and has likely witnessed others in your condition searching this forest for anything that might sustain them. Your interaction with the forest ecosystem becomes a delicate dance between predator and prey. You recognize the challenges that lie ahead and acknowledge that survival will demand more than sheer willpower alone.
Into amber tears. Even the smallest saplings show signs of having been examined and tested. Their tender shoots harvested by hands willing to try anything that might provide nutrition. Your search pattern follows a methodical approach developed through previous expeditions, starting with areas closest to the village boundary and working systematically deeper into the woods. Each potential food source requires careful evaluation, balancing the energy needed to extract it against the nutrition it might provide. A promising root system visible beneath the snow could contain tubers that might feed your family for a day, but digging them from the frozen ground could exhaust you to the point where the journey home becomes impossible. The silence of the winter forest creates an atmosphere both peaceful and ominous, broken only by the sound of your own labored breathing and the occasional crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of accumulated ice. The absence of bird songs or animal movements reinforces the reality that you're competing with creatures equally desperate for the scarce resources that remain. Even the forest's traditional inhabitants have largely abandoned this area, moving to regions where human scavenging hasn't yet stripped away every possible source of food. As you work your way deeper into the woods, following game trails that once led to abundant feeding areas but now serve mainly as paths between barren stretches of land, the morning sun climbs higher without providing any meaningful warmth. The light filtering through bare branches creates patterns on the snow that might have seemed beautiful in better times, but now serve only to illuminate the extent of nature's winter dormancy. Everything that could provide sustenance lies buried beneath layers of ice and snow, or has already been consumed by the desperate humans and animals who came before you. Your hands, exposed to the cold despite attempts to keep them warm, begin to lose sensation as you search through snow-covered debris for anything that might prove edible. The process of clearing away snow requires constant movement to maintain circulation, but each motion demands energy that your depleted body struggles to provide. The cruel irony of needing strength to find food while lacking food to provide strength creates a vicious cycle that threatens to trap you in the forest.
too weak to continue searching, but too far from home to return safely empty-handed. The numbness spreading through your fingers forces a crucial decision as you realize that continuing to search with bare hands could result in frostbite that would make any future foraging impossible. You press your hands against your body, trying to restore circulation while scanning the immediate area for anything that might justify the risk of prolonged exposure. A fallen log catches your attention, its bark partially stripped, but still retaining sections that previous scavengers might have overlooked in their haste. Approaching the log requires careful navigation through snow that reaches nearly to your knees, each step sinking deeper than anticipated and requiring enormous effort to extract your wrapped feet. The wood itself bears the scars of desperate harvesting, with sections of bark torn away in jagged patches that reveal the pale wood beneath. Your dull knife scrapes against the remaining bark with a sound that echoes through the silent forest, alerting any nearby creatures to your presence and activities. The bark that comes away in your hands feels thick and promising, though you know from experience that much of its bulk consists of inedible fiber that will pass through your system without providing nutrition. Still, the inner layer might contain enough starch to justify the energy expenditure, and the psychological benefit of having something to take home to your family outweighs the rational calculation of calories gained versus calories spent in obtaining them. As you work to harvest what bark remains accessible, movement in your peripheral vision causes you to freeze in position. A figure approaches through the trees, moving with the same careful deliberation that characterizes all human motion during these desperate times. Recognition comes slowly as the person draws closer, revealing itself to be Jack, the cooper's son, whose family cottage sits on the far edge of the village. His appearance shocks you even more than your own deterioration, his once robust frame now resembling a collection of bones held together by will alone. Jock carries a small bundle wrapped in what appears to be the remnants of a grain sack, and his eyes hold the same mixture of hope and desperation that you recognize from your own reflection in still water. Neither of you speaks immediately, both understanding that conversation requires energy better preserved for survival. But his presence creates an unexpected complication in your foraging activities. The unspoken question hangs between you. Are you competitors for the same scarce resources, or might cooperation offer advantages that individual effort cannot provide? The decision to share information about potential food sources represents a gamble with your family's survival, but Jack's knowledge of the forest might complement your own in ways that could benefit both families. His father's work as a cooper required extensive knowledge of different wood types in their properties, information that might prove valuable in identifying trees whose inner bark or roots could provide sustenance. The risk of revealing your own discoveries must be weighed against the possibility of learning about resources you might have overlooked. Communication between you develops through gestures and brief whispered exchanges that conserve breath while conveying essential information. Jock indicates a direction deeper into the forest where he believes other scavengers might not have ventured, pointing towards a section where the undergrowth grows thicker and the walking becomes more difficult. Your own discoveries, the bark you've managed to gather, and the location of the log that yielded it become bargaining chips in a negotiation conducted entirely through necessity. The decision to venture deeper into the forest together creates an alliance born of desperation rather than trust. But even temporary cooperation offers advantages that neither of you could achieve alone. Jack's height allows him to reach branches that remain beyond your grasp, while your smaller size enables you to search through dense undergrowth that he cannot navigate without exhausting himself. The combination of your different capabilities might unlock resources that would remain inaccessible to either of you working independently. The path Jack leads you along winds through increasingly difficult terrain, where snowdrifts have accumulated to depths that sometimes reach your waist. Progress becomes a matter of breaking trail through obstacles that demand careful navigation and constant attention to avoid becoming trapped in hidden depressions or unstable footing. The energy expenditure required for this journey begins to exceed what your weakened body can sustain, but the possibility of finding untouched food sources drives you forward, despite growing exhaustion.
A cluster of oak trees ahead offers the promise of acorns that might have escaped detection by previous foragers, their nuts potentially buried beneath snow in quantities that could provide substantial nutrition if properly processed. The bitter tannins that make raw acorns inedible can be leached out through repeated boiling, transforming them into a starchy paste that could sustain your families for days. The investment of time and fuel required for this processing seems worthwhile if enough acorns can be located to justify the effort. Searching beneath the snow around the oak trees reveals signs that others had indeed preceded you in this quest, but their efforts appear to be hasty and incomplete. Scattered shells and partially buried nuts suggest that previous scavengers worked quickly, possibly driven away by cold or competing demands on their time. Your more methodical approach, despite the energy it requires, begins to yield results as you uncover acorns that earlier searchers missed in their haste. Jack works systematically through the snow on the opposite side of the grove, his movements creating a rhythm that coordinates with your own efforts to maximize the area covered while minimizing wasted motion. The pile of acorns growing in your small sack represents tangible hope, each nut adding to the possibility that your families might survive another few days. The work itself provides a temporary distraction from the constant awareness of hunger and cold, focusing your attention on the immediate task rather than the broader implications of your situation. The discovery of a partially collapsed animal burrow beneath one of the larger trees raises the possibility of finding cached food stores that squirrels or other creatures might have abandoned when they fled the area or succumbed to the harsh conditions. Excavating the burrow requires careful digging with your hands and the dull knife, working to enlarge the opening without causing the entire structure to cave in and potentially bury whatever treasures it might contain. Your efforts are rewarded with the discovery of a small cache of nuts and seeds that represent a significant addition to your growing collection of potential food. The mixture includes not only acorns, but also hazelnuts and what appear to be maple seeds, each type requiring different processing techniques, but all offering nutrition that could extend your family's survival. The psychological impact of this success provides energy that seems to come from somewhere beyond your physical reserves, renewing your determination to continue the search despite mounting exhaustion. Jack's excitement at your discovery
manifests in increased efficiency as he expands his own search pattern to look for additional burrows or cache sites. His knowledge of animal behavior, gained through years of hunting during more prosperous times, guides his efforts toward locations where creatures typically store food for winter consumption. The partnership that began as a desperate alliance starts to feel more like genuine cooperation as shared success builds momentum for continued effort. The morning advances toward midday as you work through the grove, and the weak winter sun begins its early descent toward afternoon shadows that will bring even colder temperatures. The question of when to begin the journey home becomes increasingly urgent as your energy reserves approach dangerous depletion. The weight of the food you've gathered, while precious, also represents additional burden that your weakened body must carry across difficult terrain during the return trip. The decision to conclude your foraging expedition comes when Jacques stumbles and falls while attempting to reach a promising cluster of branches, his legs simply giving out beneath him without warning. The incident serves as a stark reminder of how close both of you are operating to the absolute limits of physical endurance. Helping him regain his footing requires effort that leaves you both shaking and breathless, highlighting the precarious nature of your situation and the danger of pushing too far beyond sustainable limits. The division of your combined discoveries requires careful negotiation that balances fairness against practical considerations of family size and immediate need. Jacques' family includes 3 children compared to your 2, but your household also supports Ori, whose larger frame requires more nutrition to maintain basic functions. The mathematics of survival allow for no sentimentality, only cold calculation of who needs what to maximize the chances of collective survival. The agreement you reach gives Jacques a slightly larger portion of the acorns and nuts, while you retain most of the bark and other materials that require processing techniques you're more familiar with. The seeds are divided equally, representing a compromise that acknowledges both families' needs while avoiding the conflict that could arise from perceived unfairness. Neither of you possesses enough to guarantee survival, but both have obtained resources that extend the possibility of living through another few days. The journey back through the forest tests the limits of your remaining strength as the accumulated weight of your discoveries combines with growing fatigue to make each step a deliberate act of will. The path that seemed manageable during your outward journey now appears fraught with obstacles that demand careful navigation and frequent rest stops. Jacques' condition mirrors your own, his movements becoming increasingly unsteady as exhaustion takes its toll on his already depleted reserves. The village boundary, when it finally appears through the trees, brings relief tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of your journey still lies ahead. The walk back to your cottage requires crossing open ground where wind exposure could trigger collapse or disorientation that might prove fatal within sight of safety. The irony of surviving the forest expedition only to succumb to cold during the final approach to home represents the kind of cruel twist that has characterized every aspect of life during the famine. Jacques' path diverges from yours as you approach the village proper, leading toward his family's cottage on the opposite side of the settlement. Your parting consists of brief nods that acknowledge both the success of your cooperation and the uncertainty of whether either of you will survive long enough for future collaboration. The resources you've gathered represent hope, but both of you understand that hope itself consumes energy that weakened bodies can ill afford to waste. The sight of your own cottage ahead triggers an emotional response that threatens to overwhelm your carefully maintained composure. Smoke rising from the chimney indicates that Henry has managed to keep the fire alive during your absence, an achievement that required both skill and the sacrifice of precious fuel. The knowledge that warmth and your children await inside provides the motivation necessary to cover the final distance despite legs that shake with each step and lungs that burn with the effort of breathing cold air. The door opens before you reach it, Henri's face appearing in the gap with an expression that combines relief at your return with desperate curiosity about what you might have found. Behind him, the children's faces peer around his legs, their eyes immediately focusing on the small sack you carry rather than on your own condition. The weight of their expectations settles on your shoulders, along with the physical burden of the food you've gathered. Entering the cottage feels like stepping into a sanctuary, though the interior temperature barely exceeds that of the outdoors. The fire Henri has maintained consists of just a few glowing embers surrounded by carefully positioned pieces of wood, each one representing a calculated decision about when to add fuel and when to preserve it for later use. The warmth it provides seems luxurious after hours of exposure to winter wind, but you know that this comfort is temporary and purchased at the cost of resources you can't afford to squander. The process of revealing your discoveries becomes a ceremony of hope as you empty the sack's contents onto the cottage floor. Each acorn represents possibility, every piece of bark a potential meal that could sustain life for another few hours. The children's eyes widen at the sight of actual food, their expressions reflecting amazement that such treasures still existed somewhere in their increasingly barren world. Even Henry's face shows signs of the wonder that comes with unexpected good fortune during times of absolute desperation. The work of processing your discoveries begins immediately, as delay could mean the difference between extracting maximum nutrition and losing precious calories to spoilage or inefficient preparation. The acorns require careful shelling to avoid wasting any edible material, followed by grinding and repeated washing to remove the bitter compounds that make them inedible in their natural state. The bark must be cleaned and prepared for boiling, while the various seeds need sorting according to their individual processing requirements. Marie volunteers to help with the shelling process, her small fingers proving more nimble than adult hands weakened by months of malnutrition. The task gives her something constructive to focus on, while providing a sense of contribution to the family's survival efforts. Pierre, too young for such detailed work, contents himself with watching the proceedings with the intense concentration that hunger brings to any activity involving food preparation.
The afternoon passes in careful work as your small family transforms raw materials into substances that might sustain life for another few days. The process requires constant attention to detail and precise timing, as mistakes could render precious resources inedible or dangerous to consume. Every step in the preparation represents knowledge gained through desperate experimentation during previous weeks of the famine. Techniques that would have seemed unthinkable during times of abundance, but now constitute the difference between life and death. As evening approaches and the weak winter light begins to fade, the reality of your situation reasserts itself. Despite the temporary hope provided by the day's discoveries, the food you've gathered and processed might extend your family's survival for perhaps 3 or 4 more days if carefully rationed. But beyond that lies the same uncertainty that has haunted every day since the famine began. Tomorrow will bring the same impossible choices, the same desperate search for sustenance, the same calculation of whether the energy required to seek food exceeds the nutrition that might be found. The knowledge that Jacques and his family face identical challenges provides little comfort, though it does reinforce the reality that your suffering is shared by an entire community rather than being unique to your household. Somewhere across the village, other families are conducting their own careful rationing of whatever resources they've managed to obtain, each one hoping that their preparations will prove sufficient to carry them through another night and into whatever possibilities tomorrow might bring. Henry adds another small piece of wood to the fire as darkness settles over the village, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cottage walls that once seemed cheerful, but now serve mainly to highlight the emptiness of spaces where furniture and belongings used to create a sense of home. The warmth from this modest blaze will need to last through the night, providing comfort during the hours when cold becomes most dangerous to bodies operating on minimal nutrition and failing reserves of strength. The evening meal consists of a thin soup made from the day's gatherings, supplemented with careful portions of the processed acorns and bark. The taste bears little resemblance to food as it existed during prosperous times, but the sensation of having something warm in your stomach creates an illusion of satisfaction that your mind embraces despite your body's continued protests of hunger. Each spoonful represents a small victory against starvation, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing emptiness that has become your constant companion. As your family settles into their bedding for another night of fitful sleep, punctuated by hunger pangs and cold, the sounds of the village around you tell their own story of collective endurance. Somewhere in the distance, a child cries briefly before being comforted into silence, while closer by, the sound of a
coughing echoes from a neighboring cottage where another family struggles with the respiratory problems that malnutrition brings. These nocturnal sounds create a symphony of suffering that serves as a constant reminder of how many people share your desperate circumstances. The darkness outside seems more complete than usual, as if winter itself has intensified its assault on the village and its inhabitants. Stars visible through cracks in the shutters appear cold and distant, offering no comfort or guidance for the challenges that tomorrow will inevitably bring. The night stretches ahead like an obstacle course that must be navigated carefully, each hour presenting its own threats to families whose reserves of strength have been pushed beyond all reasonable limits by months of systematic starvation. Your own thoughts turn to calculations that have become routine during these desperate weeks, mental arithmetic that weighs the energy content of tomorrow's food against the calories required for basic survival functions. The mathematics of starvation allow for no optimism, only careful assessment of how long current resources might last and what additional sources might be found before they run out completely. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers only temporary escape from these relentless calculations and the constant awareness of hunger that has become the defining characteristic of existence during the Great Famine's merciless grip on your community.
Your sleep comes in fragments, broken by the persistent ache in your empty stomach and the cold that seeps through every layer of covering you possess. Each time consciousness returns, the reality of your situation crashes over you like icy water, forcing you to confront another hour of existence, balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. The straw beneath your body has compressed into a hard mat that provides no cushioning against the frozen ground, and every position becomes uncomfortable within minutes of settling into it. Ash's breathing beside you has developed a concerning rattle that speaks of lungs struggling to function without adequate nutrition to support their basic operations. His body generates so little heat that lying next to him feels almost like sharing your bedding with a corpse, though the occasional shiver that runs through his frame confirms that life still flickers within his skeletal frame. The sound of his labored respiration mingles with similar noises from the children, creating a chorus of respiratory distress that highlights how seriously malnutrition has compromised your family's most basic physiological functions. Marie stirs restlessly throughout the night, her small body unable to find comfort on the inadequate bedding. When she shifts position, you can feel the sharp angles of her shoulder blades and hip bones through the thin fabric of her clothing, reminder that her body has consumed its own muscle and fat reserves in the desperate attempt to maintain life. Her sleep is punctuated by soft whimpering sounds that suggest dreams filled with food or memories of better times, though she never fully awakens to voice whatever thoughts might be troubling her unconscious mind. Pierre's sleep proves even more disturbed, with frequent episodes of crying that force you to choose between comforting him and preserving the warmth generated by remaining still beneath your coverings. Each time you reach out to soothe him, the cold air attacks your exposed arm with vicious intensity, but the sound of his distress proves impossible to ignore. His small body feels fevered despite the frigid air, a concerning development that could indicate the beginning of illness that your family lacks any resources to treat. The fire dies to glowing embers sometime during the deepest part of night, and the temperature inside the cottage drops to levels that make continued sleep increasingly difficult. Your breath becomes visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in the still air, while frost begins forming on the inside surfaces of the shutters, despite the minimal protection they provide against the winter's assault. The decision of whether to add more wood to revive the fire presents another impossible choice between immediate comfort and preserving fuel for tomorrow's critical needs. When morning light finally begins filtering through the cracks around your door, the gray illumination reveals a cottage transformed by overnight frost into something resembling a cave carved from ice. The water in your cooking pot has frozen solid, creating another obstacle that must be overcome before any food preparation can begin. Even the pile of processed acorns and bark from yesterday's foraging expedition shows signs of frost damage that could affect both their palatability and nutritional value. The morning routine begins with the same careful assessment that has started every day for months, checking each family member for signs of deterioration that might indicate approaching crisis. Henri's skin has taken on a waxy quality that suggests his body's systems are beginning to shut down in response to prolonged starvation, while his pulse feels weak and irregular beneath fingers too numb to provide accurate assessment. The children show their own concerning symptoms, with Marie's lips displaying a blue tinge that indicates poor circulation, and Pierre's breathing becoming increasingly shallow and rapid. Your own condition has deteriorated noticeably since yesterday's expedition, with muscle weakness that make even simple movements feel like tremendous effort. Standing requires multiple attempts as dizziness threatens to topple you back onto the straw, while walking across the small cottage demands careful attention to balance and coordination that required no conscious thought. The energy expenditure of foraging has extracted a price that your depleted body struggles to pay, leaving you weaker than before. Despite the modest success in finding food, the process of preparing breakfast becomes an exercise in conservation and efficiency that would have been incomprehensible during times of abundance. Every movement must serve multiple purposes, every action calculated to achieve maximum results with minimum energy expenditure. Breaking the ice in your water pot requires careful strikes that avoid splattering precious liquid, while sorting through yesterday's gathered materials demands visual inspection that conserves the strength needed for more physically demanding tasks. The decision of how much fuel to use for cooking creates another agonizing calculation that balances immediate needs against future requirements. A larger fire would allow more thorough cooking of the acorns and bark, potentially improving their digestibility and nutritional extraction, but would consume wood that might be needed to prevent freezing during tonight's even colder temperatures. The compromised solution involves building the smallest possible fire that can still generate enough heat to warm food and melt ice, stretching each piece of wood to its absolute maximum utility. Pierre awakens with a cry that cuts through the morning silence like a blade, his voice carrying notes of pain and confusion that break your heart anew each time you hear them. When you gather him into your arms, his body feels simultaneously hot and cold, with patches of fevered skin alternating with areas that seem nearly frozen. His eyes, when they focus on your face, hold a glassy quality that suggests the beginning of delirium that often accompanies the final stages of starvation in young children. Marie's awakening follows more quietly, her small body unable to find comfort on the inadequate bedding. When she shifts position, you can feel the sharp angles of her shoulder blades and hip bones through the thin fabric of her clothing, reminder that her body has consumed its own muscle and fat reserves in the desperate attempt to maintain life. Her sleep is punctuated by soft whimpering sounds that suggest dreams filled with food or memories of better times, though she never fully awakens to voice whatever thoughts might be troubling her unconscious mind. Pierre's sleep proves even more disturbed, with frequent episodes of crying that force you to choose between comforting him and preserving the warmth generated by remaining still beneath your coverings. Each time you reach out to soothe him, the cold air attacks your exposed arm with vicious intensity, but the sound of his distress proves impossible to ignore. His small body feels fevered despite the frigid air, a concerning development that could indicate the beginning of illness that your family lacks any resources to treat. The fire dies to glowing embers sometime during the deepest part of night, and the temperature inside the cottage drops to levels that make continued sleep increasingly difficult. Your breath becomes visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in the still air, while frost begins forming on the inside surfaces of the shutters, despite the minimal protection they provide against the winter's assault. The decision of whether to add more wood to revive the fire presents another impossible choice between immediate comfort and preserving fuel for tomorrow's critical needs. When morning light finally begins filtering through the cracks around your door, the gray illumination reveals a cottage transformed by overnight frost into something resembling a cave carved from ice. The water in your cooking pot has frozen solid, creating another obstacle that must be overcome before any food preparation.
Few thin wisps that do rise into the morning air indicate households that face the same impossible choices between warmth and conservation that define your own existence. The normal sounds of village life have been replaced by an ominous quiet, broken only by occasional coughing or the distant sound of someone chopping wood with movements too weak to create the sharp, clean strikes that characterize such work during healthier times. The church bell rings with its familiar bronze voice, though the sound now serves more as a daily miracle that the village still possesses enough life to mark time's passage than as a call to traditional worship. Father Guillaume's persistence in maintaining this routine provides one of the few constants in a world where everything else has been stripped away by the famine's relentless advance. The bell itself has become a symbol of endurance, proof that some traditions survive even when the community that created them teeters on the edge of extinction. Your spiritual life during these dark months has undergone transformations that would have been unimaginable during times of prosperity. Prayers once focused on gratitude for abundance have become desperate negotiations with divine forces that seem increasingly distant from human suffering. You find yourself bargaining with God, using promises you lack the ability to fulfill, offering devotions that require strength you no longer possess in exchange for miracles that rational thought tells you will never come. The morning's critical decision involves determining whether anyone in your family possesses sufficient strength to venture out in search of additional food sources. Yesterday's expedition extracted such a severe toll on your physical reserves that attempting another foraging trip might prove fatal. Yet remaining in the cottage guarantees that your current meager supplies will run out within days. Henry's condition clearly eliminates him from consideration, while the children lack both the knowledge and physical capability to survive exposure to the winter conditions outside. The responsibility falls to you by default. Though honest assessment of your current state suggests that even a short journey might exceed your body's capacity to endure. Your legs shake when you attempt to stand, requiring support from the cottage wall to maintain balance, while your vision occasionally blurs in ways that indicate dangerous drops in blood sugar levels. The dizziness that accompanies any change in position has intensified since yesterday, suggesting that your body's ability to regulate basic functions continues to deteriorate with each passing day. The decision to attempt another expedition crystallizes as you observe Pierre's worsening condition and realize that desperate action offers the only alternative to watching your youngest child slip away during the coming night. His fevered state could indicate the onset of illness that might prove fatal within hours, or it might simply reflect his small body's final attempt to extract energy from tissues and organs that have already been depleted beyond sustainable levels. Either possibility demands that you find additional nutrition immediately, regardless of the personal cost such efforts might exact. Preparation for departure requires even more careful planning than yesterday's expedition, as your weakened condition makes every aspect of the journey more dangerous. The rags wrapped around your feet need additional reinforcement to prevent frostbite that could injure you permanently, while your outer garments must be arranged to provide maximum protection without restricting movement or circulation. The small knife and gathering sack represent the sum total of tools available for what might be your final attempt to find food for your dying family. The psychological preparation proves even more challenging than the physical arrangements, as leaving your cottage might mean never seeing your children alive again. Pierre's condition suggests that he could slip into unconsciousness during your absence, while Marie's strength appears to be failing at an accelerating rate that makes every hour precious. The possibility that you might return to find your family dead creates an emotional burden that threatens to paralyze your decision-making process entirely. Henry's farewell consists of a weak squeeze of your hand and words too soft to hear clearly. Though the love and desperation in his eyes communicate everything that needs to be said, his acceptance of your decision to leave reflects both trust in your judgment and recognition that no alternatives exist. That staying together to die offers no advantages over the slim possibility that foraging might yield enough food to extend life for a few more days. The weight of his faith in your abilities adds pressure to an already impossible situation. The morning air outside hits your face like a physical assault. Cold so intense that your first breath causes immediate pain in your lungs and throat. The temperature has dropped even further during the night, creating conditions that make survival outdoors questionable for someone in your debilitated state. Each step away from the cottage requires deliberate effort as your muscles struggle to respond to commands from a brain operating on virtually no fuel. While the wind cuts through your inadequate clothing with surgical precision that finds every vulnerable spot, the village around you presents an even more desolate appearance than yesterday, with additional cottages now standing empty and several doors hanging open to reveal interiors that have been completely stripped of anything useful. The well in the village center shows signs of recent activity, with footprints in the snow indicating that other survivors continue their own desperate searches for sustenance. Though the tracks appear fewer and more scattered than previous days, the gradual reduction in signs of human activity tells its own story about how rapidly the village population is declining. Your progress toward the forest follows a different route than yesterday's expedition, partly to avoid areas already thoroughly searched, and partly because your weakened condition makes the direct path seem impossibly challenging. The longer route requires more energy expenditure, but offers the possibility of discovering resources that previous searchers might have overlooked. Though logic suggests that every square foot of accessible ground has been examined multiple times by increasingly desperate villagers, the boundary between village and forest arrives after what feels like hours of walking, but probably represents less than 30 minutes of actual travel time. Your perception of distance and duration has become distorted by the enormous effort required for each step, creating the illusion that simple journeys have become epic expeditions across hostile territory. The trees ahead offer both promise and threat, representing possible sources of food while simultaneously creating an environment where your weakened body could easily succumb to exposure or exhaustion. The forest floor shows even more evidence of human disturbance than yesterday, with snow churned and displaced by countless desperate hands searching for anything that might provide nutrition. Trees bear scars from bark harvesting that extends higher up their trunks than yesterday, indicating that people are taking increasingly dangerous risks to reach potential food sources. The systematic destruction of the forest's resources suggests that the area can no longer support even the reduced population that remains in the village. Your search pattern must be modified to account for your dramatically reduced physical capabilities, focusing on areas that require minimal digging or climbing while still offering the possibility of overlooked resources. The methodical approach that proved successful yesterday now demands more energy than you can safely expend, forcing you to make rapid assessments of potential food sources rather than conducting thorough investigations that might yield better results but could also result in collapse far from home. The discovery of animal tracks in the snow raises the possibility that wildlife might still exist in the deeper parts of the forest, though your weak condition makes pursuing such mobile food sources completely impractical. The tracks themselves tell a story of creatures as desperate as the human inhabitants, with signs indicating that animals have been digging through snow in search of buried vegetation or cached food stores. Even the forest's traditional inhabitants appear to be struggling with the same resource scarcity that threatens human survival. A fallen branch partially buried in snow catches your attention, its position suggesting that it might have sheltered plant material from earlier harvesting efforts. Excavating around the branch requires careful digging that conserves energy while maximizing the area searched, a balance that demands constant attention to avoid overexertion. The work itself provides temporary distraction from the gnawing hunger and growing weakness, focusing your mind on immediate tasks rather than the broader implications of your family's deteriorating situation. Your efforts are rewarded with the discovery of several mushrooms growing beneath the fallen wood, their pale caps and stems offering the promise of nutrition that could make the difference between life and death for your children.
The species appears to be one you recognize as edible, though the poor light and your own failing vision make positive identification challenging. The risk of consuming poisonous mushrooms must be weighed against the certainty that your family will die without additional food sources, a calculation that leaves little room for caution. The mushrooms represent a significant find despite their small number.
Size. As fungi can provide proteins and nutrients that plant materials alone cannot supply, the careful harvesting process requires gentle handling to avoid damaging the delicate specimens while ensuring that every edible portion is collected for transport back to your cottage. Each mushroom becomes precious cargo that must be protected during the dangerous journey home, representing hope that your family might survive another few days. The decision to continue searching despite your discovery reflects both greed for additional resources and recognition that the mushrooms alone cannot sustain 4 people for more than a single meal. The forest ahead still offers possibilities that might justify the continued expenditure of energy. Though your body's protests are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, the balance between pushing forward and preserving enough strength for the return journey creates another impossible calculation in the endless series of life or death decisions that define existence during the famine. During the A cluster of birch trees ahead offers the promise of bark that might be more palatable than the oak bark you harvested yesterday, as birch contains natural sugars that could provide both energy and improve flavor to the bitter soups that have become your family's primary sustenance. The trees show signs of previous harvesting, but their height might have protected upper sections from the reach of other desperate foragers, creating opportunities for someone willing to take risks to access higher bark. The attempt to reach higher sections of bark requires climbing abilities that your weakened body struggles to provide, with each upward movement demanding careful planning and precise execution to avoid falls that could prove fatal. Your hands, already numb from cold exposure, have difficulty maintaining grip on the smooth bark surface, while your legs shake with the effort of supporting body weight that seems impossibly heavy despite months of weight loss. The few strips of bark you manage to harvest come at enormous cost in energy expenditure that leaves you trembling and breathless. The growing pile of gathered resources in your small sack creates both satisfaction and concern, as the additional weight represents burden that your failing strength must carry across increasingly difficult terrain during the return journey. Each item collected adds to your family's chances of survival, while simultaneously reducing your own ability to complete the expedition successfully. The mathematics of gathering versus carrying capacity becomes another cruel calculation that admits no perfect solutions. The sun reaches its highest point in the winter sky without providing any meaningful warmth, its pale light serving mainly to illuminate the extent of devastation that winter and human desperation have wrought upon the forest landscape. The shadows cast by bare branches create patterns on the snow that might have seemed beautiful during better times, but now serve only to mark the passage of precious time that could be spent searching for food or conserving energy for the journey home. Your body's signals of distress have become increasingly urgent, with muscle tremors and visual disturbances indicating that you are approaching the absolute limits of physical endurance. The decision to begin the return journey comes not from satisfaction with your discoveries, but from recognition that pushing further could result in collapse that would make your efforts meaningless. The small collection of mushrooms, bark, and other gathered materials represents hope, purchased at the cost of strength you could not afford to spend. The journey back through the forest tests every remaining reserve of energy and determination as accumulated fatigue combines with the weight of your discoveries to make each step a deliberate act of will. The path that seemed manageable during your outward journey now appears fraught with obstacles that demand careful navigation and frequent rest stops that you cannot afford to take. Your legs shake with each step, while your vision blurs intermittently, creating dangerous conditions for travel through terrain that requires constant attention to footing and direction. The village boundary, when it finally appears through the trees, brings relief, tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of your journey still lies ahead. The walk back to your cottage requires crossing open ground, where wind exposure could trigger complete collapse within sight of safety and family. The irony of surviving the forest expedition only to succumb during the final approach home represents the kind of cruel twist that has characterized every aspect of life during the famine's merciless grip on your community. The sight of your cottage ahead triggers an emotional response that threatens to overwhelm your carefully maintained composure, as the small building represents safety, warmth, and the family members whose survival depends entirely on your success in finding food. Smoke rising from the chimney indicates that Henry has managed to maintain the fire during your absence, though the thin wisp suggests that fuel reserves have been stretched to their absolute limits. The knowledge that your children await inside provides motivation for the final dozen steps that separate you from shelter. The door opens before you reach it, Henry's gaunt face appearing with an expression that combines desperate hope with growing fear about what your extended absence might indicate. Behind him, Marie's pale features peer around his legs, her eyes immediately focusing on the small sack you carry, rather than on your own obviously deteriorating condition. The weight of their expectations settles on your shoulders, along with the physical burden of the resources you've gathered, creating pressure that threatens to crush what remains of your strength. Entering the cottage feels like stepping into sanctuary, though the interior temperature provides only marginal improvement over the brutal conditions outside. The fire Henry has maintained consists of glowing embers surrounded by the last few pieces of wood, each one representing irreplaceable fuel that cannot be restored once consumed. The warmth it provides seems luxurious after hours of exposure to killing cold, but you understand that this comfort is temporary and purchased at costs your family can no longer afford to pay. Pierre lies motionless on the straw bedding, his small form so still that your heart stops until you detect the shallow rise and fall of his chest, indicating continued breathing. His condition has clearly deteriorated during your absence, with fevered skin and irregular breathing patterns that suggest his small body systems are beginning to shut down. The sight of your youngest child approaching what might be his final hours creates urgency that overrides your own exhaustion and need for rest. Marie's condition shows similar decline, with bluish tinges around her lips and fingernails, indicating poor circulation that could progress to more serious problems within hours. Her movements have become even more deliberate and conserved, as if she understands instinctively that energy must be preserved for only the most essential functions. When she speaks, asking whether you found enough food to make everyone feel better, the question carries both hope and resignation that breaks your heart. Henry's assistance with processing your discoveries comes at obvious cost to his own failing reserves, but his determination to contribute to family survival overrides practical considerations about energy conservation. Together, you begin the careful work of preparing mushrooms and bark for cooking, each step requiring attention to detail that ensures maximum nutritional extraction while avoiding preparation mistakes that could render precious resources inedible or dangerous. Every step represents knowledge gained through desperate experimentation during previous weeks of famine, techniques that separate survival from death by margins too small to contemplate. The evening meal consists of mushroom soup supplemented with processed bark and the last portions of yesterday's acorn paste, creating a combination that provides both psychological satisfaction and minimal nutrition for 4 people operating on the edge of starvation. The taste bears little resemblance to food as it existed during prosperous times, but the sensation of having something warm and substantial in your stomach creates an illusion of satisfaction that your mind embraces despite your body's continued protests as darkness settles over the village once again. The sounds of collective suffering echo through the night air with increasing intensity. Somewhere nearby, a child cries weakly before falling silent, while the sound of coughing from neighboring cottages suggests that respiratory problems are becoming increasingly common among survivors whose immune systems have been compromised by months of malnutrition. These nocturnal sounds create a symphony of desperation that serves as constant reminder of how many families share your impossible circumstances. The fire dies to barely glowing embers as Henry adds the last piece of available wood, creating a brief flare of warmth and light before settling into the dim glow that must last through another night of dangerous cold. The fuel situation has reached critical levels that make tomorrow's survival questionable regardless of food. Availability. As the human body cannot endure prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures without external heat sources to maintain core temperature, your own thoughts turn to calculations that have become routine during these desperate weeks. Mental arithmetic that weighs tomorrow's food against the energy required for basic survival functions while factoring in the declining condition of each family member. The mathematics of starvation allow for no optimism, only careful assessment of whether current resources might sustain life long enough for some miraculous change in circumstances that logic suggests will never come. Pierre's breathing becomes increasingly labored as the night progresses, with episodes of distress that require constant monitoring and what little comfort your weakened state allows you to provide. His small body burns with fever that could indicate the onset of illness that your family lacks any resources to treat. Or it might simply represent his system's final attempt to extract energy from organs and tissues already depleted beyond recovery. Either possibility suggests that tomorrow might bring decisions about his care that no parent should ever face. Marie sleeps fitfully beside her brother, her own condition showing signs of deterioration that mirror Pierre's decline, but progress at a slightly slower pace. Her breathing remains steady but shallow, while her skin takes on the waxy quality that indicates her body's systems are beginning to prioritize only the most essential functions. The sight of both children approaching what might be their final hours creates emotional pain that rivals the physical discomfort of starvation. Henry's condition continues its relentless decline, with weakness that makes even basic movements require enormous effort and coordination problems that suggest malnutrition has begun affecting his nervous system. His pulse feels increasingly irregular beneath fingers too numb to provide accurate assessment, while his skin temperature fluctuates between fever and dangerous coolness that indicates his body's inability to maintain stable core temperature. The night stretches ahead like an endurance test that must be survived hour by hour, each moment presenting its own challenges to family members whose reserves have been pushed far beyond sustainable limits. The darkness outside seems more complete than usual, as if winter itself has intensified its assault on the village and its remaining inhabitants. Stars visible through cracks in the shutters appear cold and distant, offering no comfort or guidance for challenges that tomorrow will inevitably bring. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers only temporary escape from the relentless awareness of hunger, cold, and approaching crisis that have become the defining characteristics of existence during the Great Famine's merciless grip on your community. Dreams, if they come at all, blend memories of abundance with current reality in combinations that create more torment than relief, while consciousness returns repeatedly to force confrontation with the impossible situation that tomorrow must somehow be survived, despite all evidence suggesting that survival has become impossible. The cottage settles into its nighttime routine of conservation and endurance, with each family member focused on the basic task of maintaining life through another few hours of darkness that could easily prove to be their last. Outside, the winter wind continues its assault on the village and its dying inhabitants, while inside, 4 people cling to existence through determination alone, hoping against all reason that dawn might bring some change in circumstances that could extend their struggle against starvation for just a few more precious days. Just a few more precious days. Dawn arrives not with hope, but with the crushing realization that your youngest child's breathing has become so shallow it barely disturbs the frost that has formed on his lips during the night. Pierre's small chest rises and falls in irregular patterns that speak of a body surrendering its fight against starvation, while his skin has taken on the translucent quality that marks the final stages of malnutrition in children. The sight forces you to confront possibilities that no mother should ever contemplate, decisions that medieval society offers no guidance for when survival itself hangs by threads too fragile to bear examination. The morning assessment reveals deterioration across your entire family that exceeds even your most pessimistic expectations from the previous evening. Marie's condition has progressed to the point where she no longer responds to gentle touches or whispered words, her body conserving what little energy remains for the most basic biological functions. Her breathing continues steadily, but without the depth that suggests conscious awareness, as if she has retreated deep within herself to a place where hunger cannot reach. Henry's attempts to rise from the straw bedding result in immediate collapse, his legs simply unable to support even his drastically reduced body weight. The sight of your husband, once capable of lifting heavy stones and working from dawn to dusk, now unable to achieve basic sitting position, crystallizes the reality that your family has crossed into territory from which return becomes increasingly unlikely with each passing hour. His eyes, when they meet yours, carry the knowledge that his role as protector has been stripped away by forces beyond human control. Your own condition presents challenges that make even the simplest tasks feel like monumental undertakings, requiring careful planning and precise execution. Standing demands multiple attempts as dizziness threatens to topple you back onto the frozen straw, while walking the few steps across your cottage requires support from walls that feel as unstable as your own balance. The tremor in your hands has intensified to the point where holding objects becomes difficult, creating obstacles for food preparation that could mean the difference between extracting nutrition and wasting precious resources. The cottage's interior temperature has dropped to levels that make the distinction between inside and outside almost meaningless, with frost covering every surface and breath visible in small puffs that dissipate quickly in air too thin to hold warmth. The fire has died completely during the night, leaving behind only cold ashes that mock your family's need for heat, while highlighting the absence of any fuel to revive the flames. Even the minimal protection offered by walls and roof feels inadequate against cold that seems to penetrate every material barrier. The water in your cooking pot has frozen solid once again, creating ice thick enough to require significant effort to break through while risking damage to the vessel itself. The process of melting sufficient water for even minimal food preparation demands fuel you no longer possess, forcing impossible choices between creating warm liquids that might ease your children's suffering and preserving what little combustible material remains for truly desperate moments that may still lie ahead. The inventory of remaining food resources reveals supplies that could generously be described as nearly non-existent, with yesterday's gathered mushrooms and bark representing the sum total of available nutrition. The careful rationing calculations that once extended meals across multiple days now struggle to divide meager resources into portions that might sustain life for even a few more hours. The mathematics of survival have been reduced to measuring teaspoons rather than calculating daily requirements. Pierre's condition demands immediate attention that conflicts directly with the practical limitations imposed by your family's resource constraints and your own failing physical capabilities. His fever has intensified during the night, creating dangerous dehydration that requires fluids your household cannot provide, while his breathing difficulties suggest complications that medieval medicine offers no treatments for. The choice between using precious fuel to warm water that might ease his distress and conserving that fuel for cooking food becomes another impossible calculation in an endless series of life-or-death decisions. The mushrooms from yesterday's expedition require careful preparation that maximizes their nutritional value while ensuring they pose no toxicity risks to family members whose systems have become increasingly vulnerable to any additional stresses. The cleaning process demands clean water you cannot spare and careful inspection that strains eyes weakened by malnutrition, while cooking requires heat sources that exist only in rapidly dwindling supplies of combustible material. Marie's unresponsiveness creates additional complications for food distribution, as determining whether she retains the ability to swallow safely becomes critical to avoiding choking hazards that could prove fatal. The process of testing her reflexes requires gentle stimulation that might rouse her from the protective unconsciousness her body has embraced, potentially forcing her to confront pain and awareness that unconsciousness mercifully blocks. The decision between allowing peaceful withdrawal and attempting to maintain consciousness becomes another cruel choice with no clearly correct answer.
Henry's deteriorating condition eliminates any possibility of his assistance with daily survival tasks, transforming him from partner to additional responsibility that strains resources already stretched beyond sustainable limits. The sight of his frustration and helplessness breaks your heart in ways that survival engine specialist in medieval society cannot understand.
That physical pain cannot match. The decision to venture outside once more in search of additional resources conflicts directly with rational assessment of your own capabilities and the likelihood of successful foraging in conditions that have grown progressively more hostile. Your body's reserves have been depleted to points where even minimal exertion could trigger collapse far from home. Yet remaining inside guarantees that your family will exhaust their final food supplies within hours. The calculation between certain death through inaction and probable death through overexertion admits no comfortable middle ground. The village around your cottage has grown even quieter during the night, with fewer signs of human activity and an increasing number of cottages that show no evidence of continued habitation. Smoke rises from only a handful of chimneys, creating thin wisps that barely disturb the morning air before dissipating in wind that carries the scent of death and abandonment. The gradual reduction in signs of life tells its own story about how rapidly the community is succumbing to winter's relentless assault. Father Guillaume's morning bell rings with mechanical persistence that seems almost supernatural given the circumstances, though the sound now carries more defiance than invitation to worship. The bronze voice echoes across a village where fewer and fewer souls remain to hear its call, serving as testimony to faith that endures even when everything else has been stripped away by forces that seem to mock human efforts at survival. The bell itself has become a symbol of stubborn resistance against circumstances that appear designed to break all human spirit. The process of preparing your family's final meal from available resources becomes a ceremony that carries weight beyond its practical purpose, representing perhaps the last act of maternal care you will be able to provide for children whose lives hang by threads too fragile for examination. Each mushroom must be cleaned and prepared with attention that ensures maximum nutritional extraction while avoiding waste that could cost precious calories needed for survival. The work itself provides distraction from broader implications of your situation while focusing attention on immediate tasks that still offer some possibility of positive outcomes. The cooking process requires improvisation that transforms necessity into innovation, as the absence of fuel for proper fires demands alternative methods for food preparation. Cold preparation techniques developed through weeks of desperate experimentation allow for basic processing of gathered materials, though the results bear little resemblance to cooked food as it existed during prosperous times. The mushrooms can be consumed raw if necessary, providing proteins and nutrients that might sustain life even without the digestive benefits that cooking would provide. Pierre's feeding becomes an exercise in patience and careful observation, as his weakened condition makes swallowing difficult and potentially dangerous. Small portions of mushroom must be chewed thoroughly before being placed in his mouth, with constant monitoring to ensure he retains the reflexes necessary to avoid choking on food his body desperately needs but struggles to process. Each successful swallow represents a small victory against the forces that threaten to claim his life within hours. Marie's feeding requires even more careful attention, as her unresponsive state demands external assessment of her ability to handle food safely. The placement of small amounts of prepared mushroom on her tongue allows testing of swallowing reflexes while providing nutrition that might help restore enough strength for more conscious participation in her own survival. The process feels simultaneously hopeful and heartbreaking as you attempt to nourish a child who may already be beyond the reach of such interventions. Henry's portion of the meal consists of whatever remains after the children have been fed, though his condition suggests that nutrition alone may no longer be sufficient to reverse the systematic shutdown his body has begun. His attempts to consume even small amounts of food result in nausea and digestive distress that indicate his system's inability to process nutrition effectively, creating the cruel irony of starvation persisting even when food becomes available.
Your own consumption of the remaining mushroom pieces provides temporary relief from hunger pangs while highlighting how inadequate these resources are for sustaining life beyond perhaps another day. The sensation of having something substantial in your stomach creates psychological comfort that your mind embraces, despite rational understanding that survival requires quantities of food far beyond what your current resources can provide. The brief satisfaction serves as painful reminder of what normal nutrition once felt like. The afternoon brings decisions that no parent should ever face. As PA's condition continues deteriorating despite your best efforts to provide nutrition and comfort, his breathing becomes increasingly labored, while his fever intensifies to levels that suggest serious complications beyond simple malnutrition. The absence of medical knowledge or resources leaves you helpless to address symptoms that might respond to treatments unavailable in your medieval context. The choice between focusing limited energy on attempting to save Pierre versus preserving resources for family members whose survival chances might be marginally better creates moral dilemmas that admit no correct solutions. Medieval society offers no guidance for such choices, while religious teachings emphasize acceptance of divine will without providing practical frameworks for choosing between competing claims on inadequate resources. The weight of such choices threatens to crush what remains of your sanity. Marie's condition shows slight signs of improvement following the morning's feeding, with occasional responses to gentle stimulation that suggest consciousness has not entirely withdrawn. Her breathing becomes somewhat deeper, while her skin temperature stabilizes at levels that indicate her body's systems continue functioning despite enormous stress. These marginal improvements provide hope that feeds determination to continue survival efforts despite overwhelming odds against success. Henry's acceptance of his own declining condition manifests in efforts to provide emotional support and guidance that his physical state no longer allows him to offer through action. His whispered words of love and encouragement require enormous effort, but provide psychological sustenance that proves as important as physical nutrition for maintaining family morale during the darkest hours. The strength he demonstrates in facing his own mortality while focusing on others' needs exemplifies courage that transcends physical capabilities. The village's continued deterioration becomes apparent through sounds that carry across the settlement during afternoon hours when normal activity would once have filled the air with busy noise. The absence of children's voices, the silence where conversations between neighbors once provided social connection, and the reduction of working sounds to barely audible scraping and movement create an atmosphere of abandonment that highlights how completely the famine has transformed community life. The afternoon sun provides light without warmth as it tracks across a sky that seems more distant than usual, its pale illuminations serving mainly to highlight the extent of devastation that winter and human desperation have wreaked upon the landscape. The shadows cast by bare trees create patterns that might once have seemed beautiful, but now serve only to mark time's passage during hours when every moment becomes precious beyond calculation. Evening approaches with the promise of another night that must be survived through determination alone, as your family's resources have been reduced to levels that make continued existence depend entirely on willpower and whatever divine intervention might choose to manifest itself. The absence of fuel for fires means facing darkness and cold without external heat sources, while the depletion of food supplies eliminates hope for improving anyone's condition through better nutrition. The decision to gather your family close together for mutual warmth becomes both practical survival strategy and emotional comfort measure as night falls across a village where fewer and fewer lights indicate continued human presence. The shared body heat provides marginal protection against killing cold, while creating physical closeness that allows constant monitoring of each person's condition during hours when deterioration could progress rapidly. Pierre's breathing settles into patterns that suggest either improvement or the beginning of final decline with regularity that could indicate stabilization or the calm that sometimes precedes death in cases of severe malnutrition. The uncertainty creates emotional torture as you monitor each breath while hoping for signs of recovery that medical knowledge suggests are unlikely given the severity of his condition. Marie responds to gentle touches with slight movements that indicate awareness of your presence, though her strength remains too depleted for speech or significant physical responses. Her hand occasionally squeezes yours with pressure that provides communication more meaningful than words, while demonstrating that consciousness persists despite her body's systematic shutdown of non-essential functions. Henry's presence becomes increasingly important as physical decline strips away his ability to contribute practically, while highlighting his emotional significance to family stability during crisis. His whispered words of love and encouragement require enormous effort, but provide psychological sustenance that proves as important as physical nutrition for maintaining family morale during the darkest hours.
Prayers and expressions of love create spiritual comfort that transcends practical considerations while providing psychological anchors that help maintain hope when logic suggests despair would be more appropriate. The night settles over your cottage with finality that suggests this darkness might be the last your family experiences together. Though determination to see morning drives continued efforts at survival, despite overwhelming evidence that such efforts may prove futile. The silence outside has become complete, except for wind that carries no sounds of human activity, creating an atmosphere of isolation that makes your cottage feel like the last inhabited place in a world abandoned by life itself. Your thoughts turn to memories of better times, when your children laughed and played without understanding that such joy required abundance most people take for granted until it disappears forever. The contrast between past happiness and present desperation creates emotional pain that rivals physical hunger, while providing motivation to continue fighting for survival long past the point where logic would suggest surrender. The darkness ahead stretches like an infinite test of endurance that must be passed moment by moment, each hour presenting challenges that demand responses from bodies operating far beyond sustainable limits. Tomorrow remains a possibility that requires faith more than reason, hope more than evidence, and determination more than strength to transform into reality. Sleep becomes impossible as Pierre's condition deteriorates beyond anything you've witnessed during these months of gradual starvation. His small body convulses with tremors that shake the entire bedding arrangement, while his breathing develops a rattling quality that speaks of fluids accumulating in lungs too weak to clear themselves effectively. The sound fills the cottage with an ominous rhythm that drowns out even the wind outside, creating a countdown that measures time in increasingly labored breaths rather than hours or minutes. Marie stirs restlessly beside her brother, her own sleep disturbed by his distress despite her weakened condition. When consciousness briefly returns to her eyes, the confusion and fear you see there breaks your heart in ways that months of hunger never could. She understands enough to recognize that something terrible is happening, but lacks the strength to ask questions or offer comfort, leaving her trapped in a nightmare where awareness brings only additional suffering. Henri's whispered prayers become more urgent as Pierre's condition worsens, his voice barely audible above the sound of labored breathing that fills every corner of your small cottage. The words he speaks blend fragments of formal liturgy with desperate personal pleas, creating a stream of consciousness that reflects both faith and terror in equal measure. His ability to maintain religious observance while confronting the possible loss of his youngest child demonstrates spiritual strength that transcends physical capabilities. The decision to hold Pierre close against your body represents both maternal instinct and practical recognition that shared warmth might provide whatever comfort your depleted resources allow. His fevered skin feels burning hot against your own cold flesh, creating a contrast that highlights how dramatically his small body is struggling to maintain basic functions. The irregular rhythm of his heartbeat against your chest provides constant reminder of how fragile the boundary between life and death has become.
Morning light filtering through the shutters reveals Pierre's condition has stabilized at levels that suggest either improvement or the deceptive calm that sometimes precedes final crisis in cases of severe malnutrition. His breathing becomes more regular, while his fever appears to break, leaving behind skin that feels cool and clammy rather than burning with the dangerous heat that characterized the previous night. The change creates hope, tempered by knowledge that such fluctuations often represent temporary reprieve rather than genuine recovery. Marie's awakening follows more naturally than it has for days, with movements that suggest returning awareness and strength that allows her to sit up without assistance for the first time in nearly a week. Her eyes focus more clearly on your face, while her voice, though weak, carries notes of recognition and consciousness that had been absent during her previous periods of withdrawal. The sight of your daughter showing signs of recovery provides emotional fuel that helps drive continued survival efforts despite overwhelming exhaustion. Henri attempts to contribute to morning preparations with determination that exceeds his physical capabilities, though his efforts result in more hindrance than help as weakness causes him to drop items and lose balance during simple tasks. His frustration at being unable to fulfill traditional masculine roles creates psychological suffering that compounds physical distress, while highlighting how completely the famine has stripped away social structures that once provided meaning and identity. The cottage's condition has deteriorated further overnight, with frost covering every surface and ice forming in corners where moisture has accumulated and frozen solid. The absence of any heat source makes the distinction between indoor and outdoor temperatures almost meaningless, while the thin walls provide minimal protection against wind that seems to cut through every material barrier. Even breathing becomes uncomfortable as cold air sears your lungs with each inhalation. Your assessment of remaining resources reveals supplies that could generously be described as non-existent, with yesterday's mushrooms representing the final items in what was once a household capable of feeding 4 people comfortably. The mathematical calculations that once determined daily food allocation now struggle to divide nothing into portions that might somehow sustain life for even a few more hours. The arithmetic of starvation has been reduced to measuring hope rather than actual nutrition. The decision to venture outside once more conflicts directly with rational assessment of your capabilities and the virtual certainty that no food sources remain within reach of the village. Your body's reserves have been depleted beyond sustainable limits, yet staying inside guarantees that your family will face their final hours with no possibility of discovering resources that might extend survival. The choice between certain death through inaction and probable death through overexertion represents another impossible calculation in an endless series of life or death decisions. The village outside your cottage has grown quieter still, with smoke rising from only 2 or 3 chimneys in the entire settlement. The reduction in signs of human activity tells its own story about how rapidly the community is succumbing to winter's assault, while the increasing number of abandoned cottages highlights the systematic nature of the famine's advance through your population. Even the church bell's morning call seems fainter, as if Father Guillaume himself lacks the strength to ring it with his usual vigor. The forest beyond the village boundaries beckons with whatever slim possibilities might remain among trees that have been stripped and searched repeatedly by increasingly desperate hands. Logic suggests that every accessible food source has been discovered and consumed long ago, yet the alternative of remaining in the cottage means accepting defeat without exploring every avenue for survival. The psychological need to take action overrides practical considerations about energy conservation and likelihood of success. Preparation for what might be your final foraging expedition requires careful consideration of every item that might prove useful, while accounting for your severely limited carrying capacity. The small knife serves multiple purposes despite its dull blade, while the gathering sack could hold whatever treasures fortune might provide, though expectations must be calibrated to match reality rather than hope.
Each item selected represents weight that your failing body must transport across difficult terrain during a journey that demands more strength than you possess. The process of leaving your family becomes increasingly difficult as their conditions worsen and your own capabilities decline. Pierre's improved breathing provides some comfort, but his overall weakness suggests that consciousness could fade again at any moment. Marie's returning awareness creates both joy and additional worry, as her lucid moments make her more aware of hunger and discomfort that unconsciousness had mercifully blocked. Henri's acceptance of his inability to provide protection or assistance weighs heavily on his spirit, while adding emotional burdens to an already overwhelming situation. The first steps outside confirm your worst fears about the day's conditions, with wind so intense it threatens to knock you down before you've traveled even a few yards from your cottage door. The cold cuts through your inadequate clothing with surgical precision, finding every gap in your defenses and exploiting them mercilessly. Each breath burns your lungs, while your wrapped feet immediately begin losing sensation against frozen ground that offers no mercy to weakened bodies. The path toward the forest presents obstacles that would have seemed trivial during healthier times, but now loom like insurmountable barriers requiring careful navigation and constant attention to balance and coordination. Snowdrifts have grown deeper overnight, creating hazards that could trap you in positions where escape becomes impossible for someone operating with minimal energy reserves. The distance that once seemed negligible now appears to stretch endlessly ahead.
Each step demanding deliberate effort and precise calculation. The forest floor tells its own story of systematic destruction, as every accessible area shows signs of repeated searching by hands desperate enough to examine every fallen leaf and exposed root. Trees bear scars from bark harvesting that extends to heights requiring dangerous climbing, while the ground has been churned and disturbed until it resembles a battlefield more than natural woodland. The evidence of human desperation carved into the landscape creates a monument to suffering that rivals anything recorded in written histories. Your search pattern must account for severely limited energy reserves while still covering enough territory to justify the enormous risk of venturing away from shelter in your weakened condition. Each potential food source requires evaluation that balances energy expenditure against probable nutritional return, with decisions made quickly to avoid wasting strength on prolonged examination of unlikely prospects. The methodical approach that once proved successful now demands more resources than your depleted body can provide. The discovery of mushroom remnants beneath a fallen log provides evidence that others have recently searched the same areas, though their haste might have caused them to overlook smaller specimens that careful examination could reveal. The process of excavating around the decaying wood requires delicate work that conserves energy while maximizing the area investigated, creating hope that patience might yield results where hurried searching failed. Each moment spent in the cold demands justification through tangible progress toward finding sustenance. A small cluster of overlooked mushrooms emerges from beneath the rotting bark, their pale caps and stems representing treasures more valuable than gold. During these desperate times, the careful harvesting process ensures that every edible portion is collected while avoiding damage that could reduce their nutritional value or create spoilage during transport. The discovery provides psychological fuel that energizes continued searching despite growing exhaustion and increasingly dangerous cold exposure. The decision to continue searching despite your success reflects both greed for additional resources and recognition that a handful of mushrooms cannot sustain 4 people for more than a single meal. The forest ahead still offers possibilities that might justify continued energy expenditure, though your body's protests are becoming impossible to ignore. The balance between pushing forward and preserving enough strength for the return journey creates another cruel calculation that admits no perfect solutions. A section of birch grove ahead shows signs of bark harvesting that appears less thorough than the systematic stripping evident elsewhere, suggesting that hurried forages might have missed sections accessible to someone willing to invest time and effort in careful extraction. The trees themselves bear wounds from previous harvesting, but their height might have protected upper areas from the reach of other desperate searches. The possibility of finding overlooked bark provides motivation to continue despite mounting exhaustion. The attempt to harvest birch bark requires climbing abilities that your weakened muscles struggle to provide, with each upward movement demanding careful planning to avoid falls that could prove fatal in your debilitated state. Your hands, already numb from cold exposure, have difficulty maintaining grip on smooth bark surfaces, while your legs shake with the effort of supporting body weight that seems impossibly heavy despite months of weight loss. The strips of bark you manage to collect come at enormous cost and energy that leaves you trembling and breathless. The growing collection of gathered materials in your sack creates both satisfaction and concern, as additional weight strains carrying capacity that has been severely reduced by physical deterioration. Each item represents hope for your family's survival, while simultaneously reducing your own ability to complete the journey successfully. The mathematics of resource gathering versus transportation capability becomes another impossible calculation in the endless series of survival decisions that define existence during the famine. Jack appears through the trees like a specter from your nightmares, his condition so deteriorated that recognition comes slowly despite your previous cooperation. His frame has withered to proportions that seem barely capable of supporting life, while his movements display careful deliberation that characterizes all human motion when energy reserves approach complete depletion. The sight of another human being provides psychological comfort, even as his obvious distress highlights how universally desperate circumstances have become. Communication between you develops through gestures and whispered words that conserve breath while conveying essential information about potential resources and areas already searched. Jax indicates directions where his own efforts have proved fruitless, while your discoveries become valuable intelligence that might guide his continuing search for materials that could extend his family's survival. The exchange creates temporary partnership born of mutual desperation rather than trust or friendship. The decision to combine your searching efforts offers advantages that neither of you could achieve working independently, with different physical capabilities providing access to resources that might remain beyond individual reach. Jack's height allows him to investigate tree branches that remain inaccessible to your smaller frame, while your more careful approach to ground-level searching might uncover items that his hasty examination missed. The cooperation represents practical calculation rather than social bonding, though shared suffering creates understanding that transcends normal community relationships. Working together through the remaining accessible areas of forest reveals how thoroughly previous searches have combed every possible location for edible materials, with evidence of human activity extending to places that would have required enormous risk and energy expenditure to reach. The systematic nature of the searching highlights the desperation that drives people to examine even the most unlikely prospects when survival depends on finding overlooked resources. Your combined efforts yield only minimal additional discoveries that barely justify the energy invested in obtaining them. The sun reaches its highest point without providing meaningful warmth, as afternoon shadows begin lengthening across snow that reflects pale light with crystalline clarity. The passage of time creates urgency that conflicts with the need to search thoroughly, while growing cold threatens to overwhelm whatever protection your inadequate clothing provides. The decision of when to begin the return journey becomes critical, as delayed departure could result in darkness falling before you reach safety. Jack's condition deteriorates visibly as the afternoon progresses, with stumbling episodes that suggest his energy reserves are approaching complete exhaustion. His breathing becomes increasingly labored, while his coordination problems create safety concerns for continued forest travel in conditions that demand precise navigation through difficult terrain.
The sight of his decline provides sobering preview of your own approaching limitations, while highlighting the narrow margin between successful foraging and fatal overexertion. The division of your combined discoveries requires negotiation that balances fairness against practical considerations of family size and immediate survival needs. The agreement you reach gives each family approximately equal shares, while acknowledging that neither household possesses sufficient food to guarantee survival beyond another day or two. Your parting from Jacques carries the weight of finality, as both of you understand that future cooperation becomes unlikely if current resources fail to sustain life through the coming night. The brief partnership created by mutual desperation dissolves back into individual struggle for survival, as each family faces their own calculations about how to maximize whatever slim advantages their gathered materials might provide. The temporary alliance represents one of the few positive human interactions that the famine's brutal circumstances have allowed. The journey back through the forest tests every remaining reserve of strength and determination, as accumulated fatigue combines with the weight of your discoveries to make movement feel like pushing through thick mud that resists every step. The path that seemed manageable during your outward journey now appears fraught with obstacles that demand careful navigation and frequent rest stops you cannot afford to take. Your vision blurs intermittently, while muscle tremors threaten to topple you into snowdrifts that could prove impossible to escape. The village boundary appears through the trees like salvation, though you understand that the most dangerous portion of your journey still lies ahead, as you must cross open ground where wind exposure could trigger complete collapse within sight of home and family. The irony of surviving the forest expedition only to succumb during the final approach represents the kind of cruel twist that has characterized every aspect of existence during the famine's relentless advance through your community. The sight of your cottage ahead triggers emotional responses that threaten to overwhelm the careful composure you've maintained throughout the day's ordeal. Smoke rising from the
chimney indicates that Henry has managed to maintain the fire despite his weakened condition, though the thin wisp suggests the fuel reserves have reached critically low levels. The knowledge that your children await inside provides motivation for the final steps that separate you from shelter and whatever comfort your discoveries might provide. Pierre's condition shows marked improvement when you enter the cottage, with consciousness that seems more stable than during your departure hours earlier. His breathing has settled into regular patterns, while his fever appears to have broken completely, leaving behind weakness that suggests recovery rather than approaching crisis. The sight of your youngest child showing signs of genuine improvement provides hope that feeds determination to continue survival efforts despite overwhelming odds against long-term success. Marie's awareness has continued strengthening during your absence, with responses to stimulation that indicate returning cognitive function and physical capabilities. Her movements remain careful and conserved, but they display coordination that had been absent during her previous periods of withdrawal from consciousness. When she speaks, asking about your expedition and whether you found enough food to help everyone feel better, her voice carries notes of hope that break your heart with their innocent faith in your abilities. Henry's assistance with processing your discoveries comes at obvious cost to his depleted energy reserves, but his determination to contribute to family welfare overrides practical considerations about conservation of strength. Together, you begin the delicate work of preparing mushrooms and bark for consumption, each step requiring attention that ensures maximum nutritional extraction while avoiding preparation mistakes that could render precious resources inedible or dangerous to consume. The afternoon passes in careful food preparation that transforms raw materials gathered at enormous personal cost into substances that might sustain life for another day. The mushrooms require thorough cleaning and cautious evaluation to eliminate any possibility of toxicity, while the bark needs processing that removes bitter compounds without destroying whatever nutritional value it might contain. Every step represents knowledge gained through weeks of desperate experimentation with substances that would have been unthinkable food sources during prosperous times.
The evening meal consists of mushroom soup, supplemented with processed bark, and shared in portions so small they barely register as food, rather than symbolic gestures toward nutrition. The taste bears no resemblance to meals from better times, but the psychological satisfaction of having something warm in your stomach creates temporary illusion of being fed that your mind embraces despite your body's continued protests of hunger. Each spoonful represents victory against starvation, even as logic acknowledges the inadequacy of available resources. Night settles over the village with finality that suggests this darkness might test your family's endurance beyond sustainable limits. Though determination to see another dawn drives continued efforts at survival, despite evidence suggesting such hopes may prove futile, the absence of fuel for maintaining fires means facing cold that could prove fatal to bodies already weakened beyond normal human tolerance. While the depletion of food supplies eliminates hope for improving anyone's condition through better nutrition, the decision to gather close together for shared warmth becomes both practical survival strategy and emotional comfort measure as your family prepares to endure another night that must be survived through willpower alone. The combined body heat provides marginal protection against killing temperatures while creating physical closeness that allows constant monitoring of each person's condition during hours when deterioration could progress rapidly toward irreversible crisis. Pierre's improved condition provides hope that careful rationing of resources, combined with whatever divine intervention might manifest, could extend survival long enough for circumstances to change in ways that logic suggests are unlikely, but faith continues to embrace. His breathing remains steady while his fever stays broken, creating stability that allows focus on other family members whose conditions require different forms of attention and care. Marie's returning strength manifests in ability to participate more actively in family interactions while maintaining awareness that extends beyond simple biological functioning toward genuine consciousness and communication. Her questions about tomorrow and whether spring might bring relief from winter's assault demonstrate cognitive recovery that provides psychological sustenance as important as physical nutrition for maintaining hope during the darkest hours. Henry's presence becomes increasingly significant as his physical decline strips away practical contributions while highlighting his emotional importance to family stability during crisis. His whispered prayers and expressions of love create spiritual comfort that transcends material considerations while providing psychological anchors that help maintain determination when surrender would seem more rational than continued struggle. The cottage settles into nighttime routine of conservation and endurance as 4 people cling to existence through determination alone, hoping against evidence that morning might bring changes in circumstances that could extend their fight against starvation for precious additional time. Outside, winter wind continues its assault on the village and its remaining inhabitants, while inside, love and stubborn refusal to surrender provide fuel for survival that operates beyond rational calculation of odds or resources. The morning brings news that changes everything. Through the bitter wind, you hear voices carrying across the frozen village, voices that shouldn't exist in a place where most have already fallen silent. Jack appears at your door, his skeletal frame trembling, not just from cold, but from excitement that seems impossible given the circumstances. Behind him, Widow Annist shuffles forward, her face bearing an expression you haven't seen in months: hope. The words they speak feel like hallucinations born of starvation-addled minds. A merchant's wagon has been spotted on the road leading to the village, moving slowly through snowdrifts, but definitely approaching. The impossibility of such news wars with desperate need to believe, creating cognitive dissonance that threatens to shatter what remains of your sanity. Merchants haven't traveled these roads since early autumn, when the first signs of crop failure made trade unprofitable and dangerous. Yet Jack insists he witnessed the wagon himself, pulled by 2 oxen that moved with the deliberate pace of beasts, carrying heavy loads, rather than the frantic desperation of creatures fleeing starvation.
The description includes details too specific to be fabricated by minds operating on the edge of delirium. Wooden wheels reinforced with iron bands, canvas coverings that suggest protection for valuable cargo, and most importantly, the steady progress that indicates purposeful journey rather than random wandering. Aang confirms the sighting from her own vantage point near the village well, adding observations about the merchant's apparent health and the presence of what appeared to be guards accompanying the wagon. The idea that healthy, well-fed people might voluntarily enter your plague-stricken community seems absurd, yet the consistency of their reports creates trembling possibility that salvation might approach in forms too miraculous to contemplate rationally. Henry attempts to rise from his bedding with urgency that exceeds his physical capabilities, driven by hope that overrides practical limitations imposed by months of malnutrition. His efforts result in immediate collapse, but the determination in his eyes reflects emotions you haven't seen since the early weeks of crisis, when survival still seemed achievable through human effort. The sight of your husband responding to good news with anything approaching optimism fuels emotional fuel that helps drive your own cautious acceptance of possibilities that logic rejects. The children's reactions to news of potential rescue reveal how completely the famine has transformed their understanding of normal life. Marie's questions focus not on what food the merchant might carry, but on whether such people still exist in the world beyond your dying village. Pierre's confusion about the concept of trade demonstrates how thoroughly their young minds have adapted to existence where nothing can be bought or sold because nothing exists to exchange. The decision to investigate these reports requires energy expenditure that could prove fatal if the information proves false, yet the alternative of remaining ignorant about potential salvation becomes unthinkable when hope presents itself for the first time in months. Your weakened condition makes even short journeys dangerous, but the possibility that relief might arrive demands verification, regardless of personal risk involved in seeking confirmation. The village well serves as a gathering point for the handful of survivors capable of movement, creating an impromptu council of skeletal figures who huddle together for warmth while debating the reality of reported sightings.
Father Goom appears among the group, his gaunt frame draped in robes that hang like burial shrouds on his diminished body, but his eyes carry spark of divine purpose that transcends physical deterioration. The priest's presence lends credibility to reports that might otherwise be dismissed as starvation-induced hallucinations, as his years of spiritual discipline provide foundation for distinguishing between genuine revelation and desperate fantasy. His careful questioning of witnesses reveals consistent details about timing, location, and appearance that suggest actual events rather than collective delusion born of shared suffering and impossible hope. The merchant's wagon becomes visible in the distance as a dark speck moving against white landscape, its progress confirming the reality of reports while raising new questions about motivation for such dangerous journey. The sight triggers emotional responses ranging from tears of gratitude to suspicious caution about strangers who would risk entering a community marked by obvious devastation and death. As the wagon draws closer, details become apparent that confirm the presence of goods and supplies that could mean the difference between continued survival and final surrender to winter's relentless assault. Canvas-covered loads suggest quantities of materials that exceed anything your community has possessed since the famine began, while the healthy appearance of both animals and humans indicates access to resources that seem almost supernatural given current circumstances. The merchant himself proves to be a middle-aged man whose robust appearance creates startling contrast to the skeletal survivors who gather to greet his arrival. His clothing shows quality and care that speaks of prosperity continuing to exist somewhere beyond your isolated experience of systematic starvation, while his confident manner suggests familiarity with trade negotiations that your community has forgotten how to conduct. His guards display the alert posture and well-maintained equipment that indicates professional competence and adequate nutrition, creating additional evidence that the broader world continues functioning despite the localized catastrophe that has consumed your village.
Their presence raises questions about what dangers they expect to encounter while providing security for cargo valuable enough to justify armed protection. This was your reality as Marguerite, a medieval woman trapped in humanity's darkest hour. Every choice balanced on the razor's edge between life and death. Every breath demanded more strength than your body possessed. Every dawn brought impossible decisions that would haunt any soul fortunate enough to survive. The Great Famine of 1315 claimed millions across Europe, turning ordinary people into walking ghosts who fought against starvation with nothing but love for their families and stubborn refusal to surrender. In our modern world of abundance, we can barely comprehend such systematic suffering. Yet these were real people who faced unimaginable hardship with courage that transcends time itself.